Another way we can contribute to the oneness, rejecting false stories that are designed to separate us from Jehovah's organization. As an example, think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it?
Here, boys. Watch it.
So you want me to take my personal notes that give names of circuit overseers and district overseers and elders that I've personally named and destroy them? I don't think so.
Hello, everybody.
Howdy. We decided to redo this particular video.
Yeah, because when we had done the other video about, the audit checklist, we had thought about some things, hadn't we? Actual personal experiences, and it's like, you know what? I think we need to redo it.
Yeah.
So that's why it's disappeared, everybody. We're going to redo it.
Yeah. Obviously, when we hear a checklist that's encouraging elders to get rid of personal notes, there's a lot more implied with directives like that than one would really stop and think about.
Yeah.
Just simply because Kim had an opportunity to serve on a grand jury.
For 6 months?
For 6 months. And sad to say, there were a couple of child abuse, pedophile cases that she had to deal with. And so why don't you just tell them what you experienced?
Well, first let me explain, because as witnesses, I'm sure many of us have not been on a grand jury. And what it is they choose the grand jury and you work for 6 months, at least in the state that we were living in at the time. And you meet at the courthouse and everybody brings evidence, the attorneys and the officers and...
Notes taken by the officers at the time?
Well, I was just going to say, they bring all this evidence and present it to the grand jury. And then it's the grand jury that decides if there's enough evidence for the district attorney to indict or the prosecutor to indict someone who is accused of this. And this one particular child abuse case was really bad. They had arrested someone and they had over 600 videotapes. And what one of the officers had to do, and I felt so sorry for her, because even when she was testifying before us, she was just, tears were running down her face. But why I bring this up is she had notes that she had taken. Now what she had to do is she had to sit and watch all 600 of these videotapes. And every time a child was touched inappropriately, she had to write down the timestamp and what had occurred. And each one of these in her notes was a count against the accused. Right. So by time they were all done, there was like over 1,000 counts of inappropriate behavior, child abuse, the whole 9 yards. But all of these had to be, written down in private notes. Well, these notes that she brought, we agreed we did not want to see any of the videotapes, but she had to have her notes so that she could tell us, how many and what type of charges were going to be filed and how many counts and all of this. So even though personal notes may not be presentable in court and used in court against someone who is accused, the important thing is that in the process before it even gets before a trial, it goes before the grand jury and they can use these notes,
Right, so if you have a victim talking to some elders and the victim says, well, this perpetrator, allegedly brother, touched me 6, 7, 8, 9 times. If those notes are destroyed, that would be 6, 7, 8, or 9 individual accounts against the perpetrator. And it's these notes that can really determine the extent,
Severity.
the severity, and if it gets to the point of where it does go to court, that could also help sway the jury or the judge in determining how long of a sentence the perpetrator should be getting. But when these notes are destroyed and thrown away, then there's no way to be able to tell how much inappropriate conduct was actually taking place between the perpetrator and the alleged perpetrator and the victim. So
Well, I was going to say, several times, many of us heard in the Australian Commission how they kept saying, I don't recall, I don't recall. So I actually have a clip. Before you read that,
okay.
I want to just show this clip real quick.
Evidence will be put before the Royal Commission that of the 1,006 alleged perpetrators of child sexual abuse identified by the Jehovah's Witness Church since 1950, not one was reported by the church to secular authorities.
We don't want our wives knowing what our stuff, what sort of things we're dealing with. We don't want other people in the congregation coming across that information.
And would you do the same thing today if someone came and reported to you a serious allegation of sexual assault? Would you destroy any notes?
Yes, that's our practice.
So that shows, that they do destroy their notes, and then that way they can perfectly say in court, honestly say in court, I have no recollection,
Right.
I don't remember.
and they can get away with protecting or showing that they're permissive towards pedophiles. And we all do know that Watchtower, when these judicial hearings do take place, especially with child molestation, there is a sealed envelope that remains or is retained
Confidential
in
file.
the file. It's confidential, and that can be used in a court of law, but we all know that Watchtower has been less than honest with many other events. So there's no telling what is in those confidential files until they're opened up in a court of law. But another thing, most of you know that I'm reading this book. It's called How Your Unconscious Mind Rules Your Behavior. And the first several chapters of this book has to do with experimentation regarding human memory. And this book is relating a story of Professor Munstenberg, excuse me. And he's the one he was actually a professor. He taught many, many college classes, and he was able to do this completely from memory. He had all of his speech memorized. He'd never used any notes or anything. He claimed he had that good of a memory. Okay, so this particular incident I'm going to read happened to Professor Munstenberg, and I'm going to read this. The incident that inspired Munstenberg's particular interest in memory occurred a decade and a half later, in 1907. While he was vacationing with his family at a seashore, his home in the city was burglarized. Informed of this by the police, Munstenberg rushed back and took stock of the condition of his house. Later, he was called to testify under oath about what he had found. He gave the court a detailed account of his survey, which included a trail of candle wax he had seen on the second floor, a large mantel clock the burglar had wrapped in paper for transport, but then left it on the dining room table. The evidence that the burglar had entered through the cellar window. Munstenberg testified with great certainty, for as a scientist and a psychologist, he was trained in careful observation. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, bore everybody with the complete details, but as he's testifying, he was made aware of how erroneous he was in his testimony, because it was actually the police officer that let him know that the burglar came through the cellar window. He never witnessed that. He never saw that, but he recalled the officer stating that, and he viewed that as his own memory. And the thing with the candle wax, there was never any candle wax found on the floor, so he was
Or the
pulling,
clock.
or the clock, exactly.
None of that happened.
None of that happened. What he was doing is he was recalling things from previous events and attributing them to this one account of his house being burglarized. So it really goes to show that what we think that we can remember in great detail, we often cannot do that, and that's what a lot of this book is particularly about, up to this point at least.
Well, you know, when you look at the Australian Royal Commission and those the testimony that those elders were given, and they say, I don't recall, I don't remember, and they go through this whole thing, and, you know, they admit they destroyed notes. Well, they actually ended up perjuring themselves
Right.
and lying before the commission, and so it's like, you can't rely on your memory,
Right.
and don't even try, or, you know, ask them if you can have your notes in front of you. It'd be nice to have notes.
Well, actually, the best piece of advice for any Jehovah's Witness that is going to allow themselves to sit before a judicial committee is to take your own notes.
Or
Record
it.
the event. If the elders don't like it, tough luck for them. Because, as you can see, elders are given directives to destroy notes. Notes that could be used against not only the Watchtower Society, but also the elders personally.
Well, we've got a friend, Randy M, on YouTube, who's doing his own YouTube videos now, and he actually has audio that
Yeah.
he did secretly record some of these elders' meetings, and it's a good thing he did, because if these notes were destroyed, and they can turn around and say, oh, you don't remember,
Right.
you know, and blame Randy M for all of this and misunderstanding, but no, he's got the audios.
Yeah.
So, see, that's why, you know,
See, and I've also been in an other elders meeting with other brothers. Those other brothers recorded the meeting. Right, Paul? So this does go on because I know from personal experience, when you try to recall something, when you've got three elders sitting saying, well, that's not what was said. Brother Brooks, that's not what I said. You must have been mistaken, and they'll automatically turn the guilt and the blame back on somebody like myself or the victim in a child abuse case. And that's why it's so important. Screw what Watchtower says. Take your own notes, save those notes, write dates and times and names and everything else, because as we're seeing, they are taking effort to get rid of some of the notes in these cases.
well, look at when the elders showed up at our house back in 2003 over my book.
Yeah.
You know, when they came back the second time, and what they told the circuit overseer was something different than what had actually happened.
Yeah, exactly.
And because we had that recording,
It saved
how
us.
can you argue with that?
Yeah.
And it's funny because a brother in that congregation had told us when we first moved into that congregation, if you meet with the PO, you know, that's what they called him at the time, presiding overseer, cover your backside, because he lies and he twists things around. So that was one reason
Yeah.
why we recorded that meeting with them.
And that
I'm
worked
glad
out to
we
our
did.
benefit, didn't it?
Yeah, so I can see why, you know, Watchtower would want all of this information destroyed.
Or conveniently disappear.
Yeah.
So that way there, when they are in the stands, I don't recall. And it makes an easy out. But from the victim's perspective, it really seems like a lot of these cases that are going before the courts of the world, they're really becoming more and more aware of just how horrific the child abuse is in any organized religion, not just Watchtower, But so it's a very important thing that if you're before these judicial committees with something like this, do not be afraid to take your own notes, because that is your personal right. And it is also your personal right to record these, whether they like it or not, because if they don't want to be recorded, then that meeting is going to come to an abrupt end, and as far as I'm concerned, case dismissed.
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
And for that reason, I feel that this is one of the reasons why once a year Watchtower has to go through those files and get the elders to get rid of their personal notes, because these are things that, if called before a grand jury, could absolutely be used against not only the body of elders, because they're the ones that are taking notes. I shouldn't say body, but the judicial committee. That they're the ones taking notes, and those notes could contain individual counts of how many charges could come against the perpetrator.
And they may not always be accurate.
Yeah, exactly. So it's easy to get rid of those notes, burn them, shred them, than it is to have those notes called before, I don't know, something like the Royal Australian Commission.
Or a grand jury.
Or a grand jury. But the fact does present itself that this elder, as Kim showed earlier in this clip, admitted to destroying personal notes. And those personal notes contained, more than likely, a wealth of information regarding that judicial hearing that could put Watchtower even in a more of a...
precarious?
Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah. So thank you for your patience, everybody. And thank you for watching.
Bye.
Bye.